אוקיי, בכל אופן המשתתף האחרון בפאנל שלנו הוא לא פחות ולא יותר מאשר מי שארגונו הוזכר כל כך הרבה במשך כל היום, במיוחד
לא שומעים אותך.
אוקיי, בסדר. משתתף האחרון בפאנל הזה הוא מי שארגונו הוזכר כל כך הרבה פעמים במשך כל היום הזה, ובמיוחד על ידי הדובר האחרון, זהו הרי פרופסור ג'רלד שטיינברג, שתארו המוכר ביותר לכולנו הוא נשיא ה-NGO מוניטור. מלבד היותו נשיא ה-NGO מוניטור, פרופסור שטיינברג, בשבילי זה ג'רי, הוא גם מרצה במחלקה למדעי המדינה, הוא גם מייסד התוכנית לתואר שני לניהול ויישוב סכסוכים באוניברסיטת בר-אילן, מומחה ליחסים בינלאומיים, לאסטרטגיה, לבקרת נשק, ובין השאר גם לבקרה, אם תרצו, כולנו רוצה של הנשק הגרעיני של איראן, כלומר לא שייך לתוכנית שלנו היום, אבל זה בתחום המומחיות שלו, כותב הרבה בעיתונים מפורסמים בעולם, ופרופסור שטיינברג ידבר על the NGO Halo Effect and the Media Description, Analysis and Prescription. Okay,
okay. So I'm going to go straight to this. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this. I don't see Eitan, but certainly from Mickey and from others who organized this in the School of Communications. It's not really you, is it? Michael Ehrlich and others, for organizing a very, very important discussion. Having a debate, exchanging views on these important issues is something that we all need to have. That's the role of a university. Nobody should escape criticism. We heard a little bit of disjointed criticism, perhaps, of NGO Monitor and myself in some of this discussion, but also the NGOs, and I think that's precisely what we should be doing. Nobody has a monopoly on truth or on morality. Many people think that they do, and at a university in these kinds of discussions, it's important to have that discussion, this debate. So I thank you, and I hope that we will have this often in different frameworks with both repeats and also new people. We're talking about human rights, and before I emphasize the ethical aspects, well, I will. The ethical aspects is my PowerPoint. Where's the PowerPoint here, people? I got to do this myself. Okay. See, Richard's there. Where am I here?
Let's go down.
איזה שלי? כולם כתובים כאן, המצגת של...
ג'רי, אני אתן לך משאלה, תיקח את השאלות בסוף, אוקיי?
מי? אני? אני יכול למחוק כל שאלה שאני לא מפחד.
בסדר, כי אני אצטרך לעזוב. אני יושבת כאן עד 5:04. סליחה רק רגע. תודה רבה.
אישור, נכון? Sure, what the hell. When we talk about ethics, morality, and human rights, and I asked for I apologize to my Israeli students for whom my English is a little bit maybe harder to take than my broken Hebrew, but it's easier for me to squeeze it all in 15 minutes in English. We're talking about universal human rights. There are no human rights unless they are universal. There's no meaning to human rights when there are double standards. When there are unique standards, when we have post-colonial ideology which applies certain requirements to some countries' individual situations and exempts the others. So when we have a large number of human organizations that call themselves human rights groups, that claim the banner, that participate as members of the human rights community under the banner of the United Nations Human Rights Council, that frequently or repeatedly only speak about Israel, the famous permanent Article 7 of the Human Rights Council, that apply those universal standards in a very distorted manner, we are destroying human rights. And that's, I'm afraid, what we see consistently for a long time. And I understand that those people who are the religious leaders of this ideology, very often a post-colonial ideology that we just heard about, are very upset when that's pointed out, but that's exactly what we have to do. So I want to talk about the universality of human rights. I want to talk about the distortions of that universality and the damage that's done. I think it's extremely important for those who believe in the universality of human rights, and I thought we heard a very cogent and important analysis, description of that point of view from Dr. Sana earlier today, that we also recognize how those universal human rights and the morality of human rights is undermined and distorted, particularly in the Middle East, and the damage that's done. We heard earlier today, how do you move this down to the next slide? Somewhere, just click on it, okay. I'm going to talk in a minute about another example of Haaretz. In fact, Yishai Menuchin was involved in this example. But we heard earlier today about the Haaretz pseudo-poll. Many people, most of the newspaper stories on this ignored the fact that somebody paid for this. That in fact this poll, the pseudo-poll, was formulated and presented to Gidon Levy by a non-governmental organization, a group called Signing Anew, Chotmim Michadash, which was funded by the New Israel Fund, and what they, I think, now realize was a tremendous mistake. But these mistakes happen too often. Haaretz apologized for that. But the people involved in this, including Amiram Goldblum, has not apologized for that. And that's part of the process here. When mistakes are made, they have to be dealt with. Now, in the journalistic community, in Israel in particular, there are mechanisms for dealing with ethical violations. There are, in a number of prominent newspapers, like the New York Times, there's a public editor. And sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully, the public editor is independent of the rest of the newspaper staff and will often criticize his or her own newspaper for violating ethical norms. And that's extremely important for powerful political organizations. And of course, when we're talking about NGOs like Amnesty, Mr. Menuchin's organization in Israel now, formerly it was called something called the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, same Menuchin, different titles. Those are powerful political organizations, like Human Rights Watch, like B'Tselem, like Gisha, because what they say has this tremendous impact on the international media, on diplomats, for the reasons that we heard earlier, the inability of many journalists to be able to actually investigate this for themselves. When you have this kind of power, whether it's through the media or NGOs or governments, there must be checks and balances. There must be this kind of ethical framework. In Israel, journalists voluntarily are members of an ethical council or an ethical court. And a few years ago, 2 years ago, Haaretz ran an article about a parliamentary discussion that took place in Brussels, the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights. And Mr. Menuchin spoke there. The head of, or one of the people who was the head of the Musawa organization, an Israeli NGO, spoke there. Another European group spoke, the European Mediterranean Human Rights Network, and I spoke there. Haaretz's report didn't mention not only that I spoke there, but they also distorted completely the nature of the discussion. Turned out that Haaretz simply cut and pasted from a press statement of one of the NGOs. This is exactly the example my colleague Ann Hertzberg talked about and others talked about earlier, about the lack of due diligence among journalists. Now, in this case, we went to the ethical court of the Journalists Association in Israel, and we presented the case twice because they appealed after they lost. Haaretz presented its case, and the court adjudicated and found Haaretz guilty and told Haaretz it had to, in fact, publish, which they did, not on page 5, but in a more obscure place, an acknowledgement that, in fact, this story was not journalistically, it did not reflect journalistic ethical standards. The problem is that in the NGO community, there are no ethical frameworks. There are no standards that are generally accepted, and therefore, there's no self-policing, there's no independent framework. We heard earlier about some of the crises and mistakes and problems that Amnesty International has. The mechanisms at Amnesty, to the degree that it has these mechanisms, are not functioning. And that's a serious problem. Human Rights Watch, another NGO superpower with tremendous influence, has never been called upon to account for its flirtation and support and marketing of the Gaddafi family as human rights reformers, and many other examples like that. So not being able to hold to account NGOs that claim universal human rights values and principles. Somebody left their phone here. Eliza Landis, your phone's ringing. Finally. Ethical human rights values that they claim to reflect, but in fact, very often contradict and undermine those values, create some very serious problems. So these the example, for instance, of the ethical court of the Journalists Association, I think is a very important one. This is the text of the decision that was issued by the Israeli Press Council, the Ethics Court, and it shows that talks about the fact that they gave the reader a picture far removed from the factual truth, the defendant's reliance on two sources with a vested interest, NGOs. There's a consistent pattern here, and we've talked about it all day, so I'm going to say it just very briefly. Newspapers like Haaretz and the Washington Post and the Telegraph and the Guardian, and sometimes the New York Times, but I think there's been an understanding that, in fact, quoting from NGOs without fact-checking on the ground is very often a sign that the newspaper is not performing to the standards that it claims to hold. And in this case, I think there was an important lesson that was learned. There is something unique. There is a reason for these very sharp deviations from universality and morality and ethics in this nexus between NGOs and the media when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I start this, Dr. Sen, I hope you'll permit me, with the Durban Conference. And you mentioned it earlier. Because it's the NGO forum in particular. The fact that there were 1,500 organizations under the banner of human rights, 5,000 representatives, and in their final declaration, it's a declaration of war against Israel. It's immoral, fundamentally immoral, and unfortunately Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were very active participants. The text was largely written in the preparatory conference that took place in Tehran that Mary Robinson presided over. She should never have done it, and of course the promises that were made to provide visas for those who did not hold these opinions, Israelis and Jews, was never implemented. At that point, the whole Durban process, at least the NGO part, should have stopped. It was clearly going to end immorally, and this text reflects this complete violation of universality, the singling out of Israel, lies, double standards. Look how many times the word apartheid is in there. From here to the Haaretz headline on apartheid and many, many NGO reports that use this language as a straight line. This is political propaganda. Politics is legitimate, propaganda is legitimate, but not under the framework, not under the ethical facade of human rights, because it destroys the values that human rights are supposed to promote. When these NGOs, and the process is very clear, which are very closely connected to the UN Human Rights Council, formerly Commission, which is dominated by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, or now Cooperation. Anybody want to tell me that the OIC, Iran, Libya, Egypt, Algeria, Syria, that they don't have an agenda? Of course they do. The agenda is, let's not talk about our human rights violations, let's only talk about Israel. And so we have the Jenin massacre myth, we have the Beit Hanun pseudo investigation, Desmond Tutu. We have, of course, the Goldstone report, which is thoroughly discredited. But as Richard Landis showed us, as soon as the NGOs make these declarations, and the first time that I heard the word massacre in connection with Jenin, in 2002, was on the BBC, voiced by an Amnesty International official, who was nowhere, the first time I heard it, who was nowhere near what was going on there. And then from there to Terry Larson and others. From the NGOs to the media, so many reports that are written by NGOs without the knowledge on the ground, and through that bias are immediately picked up by the media, as we heard, and then of course the UN and diplomats, and my colleagues in academia then we quoted as footnotes as if in fact there was some value added, and there's none. These kinds of quotes were shown earlier. There are dozens and dozens of these quotes where the media, using the halo effect, simply quotes the NGOs without due diligence. And that, of course, creates false narratives, reinforces those narratives, all the factors that I talked about. NGOs also pretend to claim expertise in international law. And in most cases, they either have none. How was Amnesty International created? It was created in the 1960s on behalf of prisoners of conscience. That's its expertise. Amnesty does not have, and never had, and neither does Human Rights Watch, a deep expertise in asymmetric warfare. in the kind of conflicts that exist around the world, particularly Israel, Gaza, 2008, 2009, or Lebanon. And yet they make the pretense of having that expertise. So we have the language of international law being used, quoted by the media, wrong. The language is wrong, the media is wrong, the quotations are wrong. Often they invent international law. And then it, of course, gets in and it gets quoted by Goldstone reports, and then, of course, the authors of these reports, if they have integrity, back off and say, oops, I made a mistake. And the mistake was not checking the details by themselves. NGOs, as everybody acknowledges, have agendas. We heard Amnesty Israel's agenda just a few minutes ago. Distorted, but that's their agenda. And so it has to be taken in that framework. These are political organizations. 50 NGOs provided 500 footnotes to the Goldstone report. The Goldstone report is discredited, therefore all these NGO reports are discredited because they are not based on facts on the ground, on a detailed analysis. They are based on Palestinian testimony, often contradictory, often taken while members of Hamas are in the room. Same thing's true in the 2006 Lebanon war, the Kana incident, and many others that Ann Hertzberg talked about, where the claims were part of the Hezbollah process, and people who made those claims were under the control of Hezbollah. If you're in southern Lebanon during the war, you're obviously part of the Hezbollah framework because they don't let anybody else live there or speak there. But very few, I don't remember any NGOs questioning that. I remember that it was CNN at the time, Anderson, what's his first name? Anderson Cooper, and Nick Robertson, maybe it was Nick Robertson, who said, I'm reporting from Lebanon under basically Hezbollah censorship, but nobody else said that. So when Human Rights Watch and Amnesty make claims about what they heard in southern Lebanon, there's no distancing from that. There's no caveat, there's no footnote, whoops, under Hezbollah censorship. Amnesty International, if you look at the agendas for the period 2005 to 2011, we counted page by page. You can do that by computer now, or a lot of research assistants. And you see that from 2005 to 2011, 67 pages on Syria, almost nothing. Almost 10 times as much attacking Israel. That is the tragedy of human rights. That is the destruction of human rights. Unethical, immoral, and yet no mechanism to correct that, in addition to the other failures of Amnesty. And the reports from Human Rights Watch are very similar. Why are we going in this order? I don't know. Okay. So I'm going to summarize by simply saying that the claims of human rights violations by NGOs need to be checked very carefully. They need to be sourced. They need to be put into a context which is often missing. When Gisha counts calories and doesn't count rockets from Gaza, there's something morally wrong there. Fundamentally morally wrong. And there are many excuses and justifications, but none of them have a moral, ethical foundation. It's part of a political framework, a political agenda, which is legitimate, but let's not pretend it's human rights. There are many factors in this process. I talked about them. This would require more time, and I suggest if you want to, we've been writing about this in some detail and documenting that. Many different factors. Yishai Menuhin likes to attribute everything to Israeli paranoia about anti-Semitism. It's number 4 on the list, and there's a lot of evidence for that in certain parts of Europe. Yishai, it's a lot more complicated than this. It's a good chance to look at the details. Change the ideology. Broaden your view a little bit. It'll make a much better contribution to Amnesty. Richard Goldstone had the courage to admit that he was wrong. I think there are others that need to have that same moral courage. To use the London guidelines of unbiased reporting, of professional examination of the evidence, even if it means you're not going to get the headline in the morning, because you really don't know what happened last night. Because if you're a PR organization, don't claim to do human rights. This is a chance for me to repeat that Ann Hertzberg and I have co-authored a book called Best Practice for Human Rights and Humanitarian Fact-Finding by Nyhoff Publishers. And what we found, what was interesting, is that no such book existed before. That there were and are no standards, no methodological standards, no ethical standards. And so what I'm going to say and what I'm going to end with is the need for those standards. Danny Seidman spoke. Danny, you're not going to get completely away from this. You talked in one of your first sentences, and you used the words human rights and politics in Jerusalem in the same sentence as if they were the same. We disagree on a lot. We also have a common background, and I think that there's a lot still there in common in terms of the passion and the importance of the values and the principles. But one point where we differ is that I think it's extremely important to separate politics from human rights. Human rights are values, they are universal. Politics can be very particular and interest-based. And sometimes I see in the work that you do, and others, and of course I accept the same focus on me. We have political positions, but we also need to remember that the values and principles are universal and not to mix the two of them up. In many ways, when that happens, what you do is you create a callousness. And when human rights are replaced by politics, the public turns off to human rights. How do you educate an 18-year-old soldier going into the military on the values of human rights, on right and wrong, when all he and she have heard are political distortions and the abuse of human rights by political groups, whether it's B'Tselem or Breaking the Silence or Gisha or Amnesty International? So I think the common values here, and on this I end, have to be to restore the universality of human rights and take all of our personal political baggage and leave it on the side and do that in a different form. Thank you.